If you ever played the game of Monopoly, you might have had the fortunate experience of picking one of those community chess cards that says, "Bank error in your favor, collect $200. If something like that were to happen in real life, we might consider it a miracle. But in today's story, we're going to hear about just that. When something happened that left bankers asking, was it a mistake or was it a miracle? If that's something you like to think about, welcome to Check Your Head Stories, where we consider the bright side of things can be quite disturbing with tales of the miraculous, curious, and the oddly beautiful. Let's get to it. Check your head. What do you like to think about? It was 2008 in Orange County, California, and Jeff Frankenfeld, a former Marine, and his wife Faith were at the top of their game. Happily married, they enjoyed raising their 2 kids. Jeff was able to provide handsomely because he'd worked his way up to the executive level and led the sales force for his company. Jeff was also a man of faith. He was very involved with his church, and even though he had a busy work schedule and was a dutiful father and husband, he still found time for hands-on ministry serving at his church. By all accounts, the Frankenfelds were living a charmed life. Jeff was doing a stellar job as provider and leader of his family, and he was careful to keep it that way. But as conservative as Jeff was, making sure he did all the right things by all those he was responsible for, he was no stick in the mud. Jeff was a guy that was willing to take risks, especially when it came to his faith. But true to his nature, he was careful not to expose those he was caring for to some of the hazards that might come along with his adventures. So when Jeff began to sense there was a calling from God for him to drop everything and move to Florida to help establish a new church plant, he carefully considered how he could follow that prompting and still be responsible to take care of his family. And Jeff didn't rush into anything, and he began to carefully plan how he could make this move. After several months, his wife Faith, true to her name and her character, agreed to this plan to uproot the family and move to the Orlando area. Now, Jeff was such an asset at his company, they didn't want to lose him. So they agreed that he would be allowed to continue on and work remotely, but his compensation would be lowered, but they were not willing to let him go. Jeff and Faith decided not to sell their house, but to keep it and rent it out. Now, in the months that they were setting things up and putting everything into motion, they began to hear rumors that the booming economy might be based on something that was a little less than solid. And then the unimaginable happened. The economy experienced a complete collapse, and the nation was thrown into the worst recession it had seen since the Great Depression. Despite Jeff's careful planning, his company informed him that due to the downturn, his position could not be justified, especially being a remote position. So Jeff was terminated. It was April of 2009, and Jeff's father, who did not share Jeff's faith, asked him, "What are you doing? How are we going to provide for your family?" He said, "Jeff, this doesn't seem right." Jeff pushed back and he said, "No, I believe this is a calling from God, and being that, God will provide." 2 months later, Jeff was busy loading up the pods with furniture for their move to Florida, and they got the news that their house value had taken a drastic decrease. At the time, houses were losing 50% of their value or more overnight. This meant that they weren't going to be able to rent the house for as much as they hoped, and now the house was more of a liability than an asset. Jeff began to feel very troubled. He left the packing and he went into the hills behind his house in Aliso Viejo, and he began to cry out to God. He began to ask God, did I somehow mishear? Is this something just from my own pride? Am I making this up? Is this some great failure? Am I just leading my family into disaster? While he was there on that mountain, God spoke to him and said, "My son, it's going to be all right." That assurance was enough for Jeff. So he came down from the mountain, finished packing, and he and his family arrived in Orlando later that week. In order to survive, Jeff cashed out his 401k, and the company he worked for agreed to keep him on as a consultant, but they could only pay him about $1,000 a month, and that was not nearly enough to take care of a family. After they found a place to move into, the security deposit, the moving expenses, it all added up. And by the end of 2 months, they were completely out of money. Despite having one setback after another, Jeff was convinced that God was going to provide. Jeff's dad and his stepmother had planned a trip to come to Orlando for a business meeting, but they also wanted to see where Jeff and his family were now living. When they arrived, Jeff's father was very upset when he discovered how dire the situation was. Now, Jeff's father wasn't trying to shame his son, but he was so disturbed by what he heard. The way the words came out, it almost seemed like he was really tearing him down. Jeff's dad had been traumatized at church as a young boy of 6. He didn't usually go to church, but he went to Sunday school. The Sunday school teacher told the children that they were going to all say something that they were thankful to God for. This was upsetting to Jeff's father because this little boy was very shy. He hated speaking in front of people. Student by student, they just kept saying what they were thankful for. And as they went down the line, Jeff frantically tried to come up with a plan. Then he thought of something. I can say this. He was going to say what he was thankful for, and then the boy before him said exactly what Jeff's dad had planned to say. This mortified Jeff's dad, and so when his turn came, he didn't want to just copy, so he tried to think of something, but nothing was coming. The Sunday school teacher began to become upset. She said, "Don't you feel thankful for anything?" And he couldn't say a word. He got more nervous and became completely tongue-tied. Then the Sunday school teacher said, "You're going to make God mad if you don't say something you're thankful for." The little boy couldn't speak for himself, and so she grabbed him by the ear and took him to the pastor. The pastor had no more compassion than the Sunday school teacher did, and he said, "You know what? If you're going to be this ungrateful, God doesn't like that, so when you can come back and be a thankful good boy, we'll welcome you back." They sent him home. And since that day, Jeff's father had never entered a church again, and he thought Christianity was merely toxic mind control. Given Jeff's dad's attitude about faith and his deep concern for his son's family and their welfare, his words came out very harsh. Now, Jeff was an ex-soldier and he had learned to control his emotions, but this struck deep. Jeff didn't want to show disrespect to his father, but he doubled down. He said, "No, Dad, I love you, but I believe God's going to provide." Although the standoff between the two men never got too heated, it remained quite tense. But both were relieved when they ran out of time because Jeff's father had to go to his scheduled business meeting. While his father was gone and at his meeting, Jeff was left alone to reflect on some of the things his father said. Now, he had been fighting these kinds of thoughts of regret and wondering if he'd been reckless for quite a while. But now, given the power of his father actually saying those same things, they hit in a different way. He began to feel real torment, and he really struggled. But then he just decided, I'm not going to embrace these thoughts. I've got to hold on to my faith. So once again, he won an inner battle. And within the hour, there was a phone call. Jeff's old company was calling to inform him that even though the economy was in a terrible situation, the company had experienced an unexpected upturn. In fact, so much so that they were growing and they wanted to expand into Florida and the Southeast. And they needed somebody to head up the team, and what could be more perfect, one of their top producers was already there. He didn't even have to be relocated. So they offered Jeff the job at his old salary with all the same benefits. Only now the cost of living was much lower, so this was like getting a huge raise. Jeff was overjoyed. When Jeff's dad returned to the house after his business meeting, Jeff was able to greet him with a huge smile, and he said, "Dad, I told you, God's going to provide," and he already has. He gave him the news. He said, God's going to provide and then some. Jeff's dad was flabbergasted. Although God was completely providing for the Frankenfelds as they took this step of faith to minister in Florida, there was still a problem. The house back in California was in albatross. It was bleeding them dry. Jeff knew he needed to do something, so he looked into a refinance so they could restructure the payments so they'd be more manageable. Jeff got all the paperwork together and he signed the refinance docs. And he sent them off to California in a FedEx envelope. The next day, FedEx arrived with another envelope. Now, Jeff was surprised that the turnaround had been that quick. He was expecting to find a confirmation of all the loan docs and final paperwork, but when he opened the envelope, it was simply a one-page letter. He wondered, what is this? Is there some snag? But then, when he read the words that were before him, he didn't quite know what to make of it. Even though this was an official letter from a banking institution, the phrasing seemed almost uncharacteristically simple and almost friendly. It said, "Dear Mr. Frankenfeld, although you have done nothing to deserve this, we have decided to offset the recent loss to your home's value. We are forgiving $186,555 of your current loan. Future statements will reflect this change and your payments will be adjusted accordingly. Sincerely, Bank of America." Jeff couldn't believe what he was looking at. He thought, no way, this has got to be a bank error. So he called the bank to confirm his suspicion that this letter was illegitimate. And when he got through to a customer service agent, the agent actually laughed and said, "We don't do that." He looked around a little bit more. He said, "No, I see no mention of it, nor have I ever heard of anything like that. We don't have that policy." Jeff thanked the customer service agent. He was only slightly disappointed because not for a minute did he think that this was legitimate. And then he hung up. He was about to throw the letter away and forget all about it. But still, something was nagging at him. He wasn't quite ready to let this go. So he decided he was going to maybe pursue it a little bit more. So the next day he called and spoke to an agent and got a very similar response. But still, somehow it was bothering him. He tried again, and then he tried some different departments. He kept trying for the next few days, just thinking there's something about this. He prayed about it, but he didn't get some clear answer, but he still did not feel like he was supposed to just quit. He thought, I got to keep on trying. So finally, on his 10th call, he got through to an agent. But this agent had a little more initiative and was taking an interest in this. He goes, this is very interesting to me. Let me try a few things. And he typed, no, that's not it. He said, oh, well, let me try this. He typed furiously again. No. Oh, well, maybe this. He kept trying different configurations, different departments. He kept Jeff on the phone for almost 2 hours. And then he typed and said, oh my gosh, there it is. He said, there it is. I've never heard of this before. It's like a miracle. He said, I'm happy to inform you, sir. Yes, you have been forgiven $186,555. It's going to be taken off your loan balance. It's a good thing you called because you sent in those refinance forms and those have to be halted right now. Otherwise, it's going to clog up the whole system and make this all confused. He said, let me take care of that right now. He spent some more time on the phone. He updated all the different departments, all the different files, and he said, there, it's all done. Everything's in order. The change should be reflected in your next mortgage statement. Congratulations. And by the way, did I say this really is like a miracle? Jeff couldn't believe it, but on the other hand, he completely believed it. God had been faithful to provide and take care of every need. And he showed me his tax statement. I saw the line where it said, write off $186,555. It's true. While I was interviewing Jeff, he got so excited, he had trouble sometimes sticking to the story because it kept triggering other stories of miracles in his life. It's just the way it is. As you live a life of faith, you begin to see miracles if your eyes are open. Jeff and his family continue to live a life with faith adventures marked by miracles great and small, as well as great trials, which they've also come to expect. And so it is with a life of faith and miracles. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's story, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to come back next time for more stories of the miraculous, the curious, and the oddly beautiful. See you next time.